Good morning for those who are joining us, and welcome to the 10th Annual Sacred Trust Books Talks and Book Signing event here at Gettysburg National Military Park. This event is co-sponsored by the Gettysburg Foundation and by Gettysburg National Military Park. Our next speaker is Dr. Jen Murray. Dr. Murray is going to discuss Nor Long Remember Gettysburg, 1863 to 2013. The Gettysburg Battlefield remains the most contested and sensationalized landscape on American soil. Initially preserved as a memorial landscape to honor the soldiers who fought and died in July 1863, the battlefield has evolved into a landscape of patriotic expression, commercialization, and controversy. This battlefield was never a static landscape, but an ever-evolving memorial to war. Studying the history of this battlefield highlights Americans' connection to the landscape and various memories of the battle and of the American Civil War. Dr. Murray is an assistant professor in the Department of History at the University of Virginia's College at Wise. She specializes in United States history, Civil War and Reconstruction, and military history. She has written numerous articles and papers, given many presentations, talks, and tours. And her most recent book, just published in May of this year, is On a Great Battlefield, The Making, Management, and Memory of Gettysburg National Military Park, 1933 to 2013. Dr. Murray was awarded a fellowship in 2009 from both the United States Military Academy's Summer Seminar in Military History and the Robert E. Lee Symposium in Stratford Hall, Virginia. Please extend a warm welcome with me to Dr. Jen Murray.
Thank you, Cindy, for that very kind introduction. They say that there's a danger in having your friends introduce you, but that was very much professional. I appreciate that. And thanks to the Gettysburg Foundation for having me out here today. And thanks to you all. You look more rapt attention than my 10:30 freshman sitting in class down at UVA Wise, so I appreciate that for sure. What I want to talk to you about today... Are we okay with this? There we go. What I want to talk to you about today is the history of the Gettysburg Battlefield. One of the things that was left out in my very gracious introduction was that I worked here for the National Park Service as a seasonal ranger for 9 summers. And when I was at Auburn working on my dissertation, I was trying to come up with a topic. And what is there left to say about the American Civil War that's not been said already? And Gary Gallagher had that article that came out a couple years ago where Gary Gallagher asks, what is there left to say about Gettysburg? And indeed, it seems like this is a topic that's been saturated, examined, and re-examined. But what has not been really examined thoroughly is the history of the Gettysburg Battlefield. And that's the topic of my dissertation and the topic of my first book, and what I want to walk you through in the course of our hour lecture or so today. Let me start with a question for you, though. 151 years ago, the Battle of Gettysburg, a 3-day battle, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1863, has produced a voluminous amount of literature. Just walk into our bookstore here, walk up and down the shelves, and look at how much stuff has been written on this 3-day battle. We have battle campaign studies, numerous campaign studies. We have books on each day of the battle. We have how many books that's written just on Pickett's charge. We have books on the animals at Gettysburg. We have books on the monuments at Gettysburg. We have books of maps on the Battle of Gettysburg. How many books do you think has been written on the Battle of Gettysburg since 1863? What do you think our count is in Gettysburg historiography? Not enough. That's encouraging. Hey, that keeps me employed. I appreciate that. What do you think? Throw me a number. 5,000. You're close. It's about 6,000. 6,000 books written on the Battle of Gettysburg. Last year, 2013, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, John, I think it's 23 books that came out. 26 books came out just last year on the Battle of Gettysburg. So Gary Gallagher's question is very apt. What is there left to say about this battle and this battlefield? Well, there's a lot left to say about the 150-year era of this landscape. So what my topic looks at, my book and our talk today, looks at a 150-year-long era of the battlefield. What happened to this landscape after July 3rd, 1863? And what I highlight are issues of preservation, how this landscape has been preserved, how it has been interpreted, and the controversies of doing so, the commercialization of this landscape, who owns Gettysburg, who creates these narratives, and which narratives are most dominant, and what does this landscape mean to us today, 151 years later? What is it about Gettysburg that is so unique? What is it about this landscape that compels us here more than any other battlefield in the American Civil War? The National Park Service records well over 1 million visitors to this battlefield each year, far more than any other of the war's battlefields. What is it about Gettysburg that makes this place so special? That's one of the questions that we'll seek to address today. In the field of Civil War history, Civil War historiography, there's a new genre that's coming out that's called Civil War memory. And historians and scholars are starting to look at how memories have shaped our interpretations of the battle. And some of the leading scholars on Civil War memory are David Blight's Race and Reunion. If you've not read that book, it's a fantastic book about memories of the Civil War. And that's one of the trends that I look at in my book as well. And specifically, I look at how the National Park Service has managed and interpreted this battlefield and how they manufacture memories in your experience here today. The National Park Service, as we'll see, acquires this battlefield in 1933, and they have a very long-standing controversial era here in interpreting the Battle of Gettysburg. I always ask this question when I do this talk, just kind of get a scope of what Gettysburg means to you, but why Gettysburg is so important. 51,000 casualties make this the war's bloodiest battle, far in totality of the next top, but do casualties alone make this a place worth commemorating and interpreting and sensationalizing and promoting to the same extent that's done today? How many of you have been to Antietam, just right down the road south of us? I mean, the difference between visiting Antietam and Gettysburg is pretty stark, right? It's like Gatlinburg, right, compared to some small place in Wyoming. It's a very different contrast in these two landscapes. Little Round Top, 72 hours, battlefield, bring these places iconic landscape names. Before July 1863, Gettysburg and these landscapes had no national importance at all. But 72 hours of fighting have propelled these places into national memory and national mythology, history, and interpretation. The landscape is used to commemorate war. In its simplest form, Gettysburg is a battlefield to commemorate war. It's a place where we memorialize, honor, and pay tribute to those who have fought and died. The stories, the myths, the interpretations, the legends of this battle are created right after the men leave the field. The Philadelphia Inquirer headlines on July the 4th, Waterloo eclipsed. And just think of that analogy where the Philadelphia Inquirer is comparing the Battle of Gettysburg to Waterloo. I mean, we can debate today whether or not Gettysburg is the turning point in the American Civil War, and there's pretty compelling arguments to say that it's not. I hate to say that, but it's not. But it is compelling in the national narrative. And the veterans, and now us and subsequent generations, have created Gettysburg and interpreted it to be this high tide of the American Civil War. So what is it about Gettysburg that makes this landscape different than the scores of other fields where Union and Confederate soldiers fought and died? I'd like to suggest in part that it's Lincoln. I'll show you through the next couple slides here and through the remainder of the talk how Abraham Lincoln has become central to the Gettysburg narrative. It's at Gettysburg that Lincoln comes here November the 19th, 1863, and he dedicates the Soldiers' National Cemetery. He consecrates this landscape, and he gives a new birth of freedom, 272 words. He makes sense of what this war had been about. There's a pretty good book on the Gettysburg Address by Gary Wills called Lincoln at Gettysburg. And in it, Gary Wills suggests that why the Gettysburg Address is important is because it's transcendent. That it's so vague, it's not specific to the Battle of Gettysburg, but it's malleable. And over time, subsequent generations of Americans have come back to Gettysburg, they've come back to the Gettysburg Address, and they have found meaning in these 272 words. And what we'll see through my program today, I'll give you two very good examples of this. The timelessness of the Gettysburg Address. 272 words you're all familiar with. In 1940s, 1960s, 1980s, 2000s, the Gettysburg Address is interpreted very differently by Americans. I want to give you two examples. This is the opening phrase of the Gettysburg Address, of course, and pay attention to the last phrase, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. When do you think that Americans would look at this part of the Gettysburg Address and draw meaning out of that phrase that all men are created equal? What time period in the 20th century can you see Americans emphasizing the notion that all men are created equal? Exactly, the 1960s. So the 1960s version of the Gettysburg Address is Lincoln was speaking here about racial equality, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. 2 decades before, 1940s, Americans interpreted the Gettysburg Address differently. Pay attention to the last phrase in that segment. Government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. When do you think Americans would find relevance in talking about freedom of government and freedom from tyranny? Yeah, World War II, the Cold War. That's how the Gettysburg Address is interpreted in the 1940s. Very different readings of the Gettysburg Address and how we take a look at this. So, the history of the Gettysburg Battlefield. 150-year-long era that has 3 different preservation organizations affiliated with it. The first is the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. This is the first preservation agency that takes place or forms or establishes itself in 1864. This is remarkable because in 1864 the Civil War is still going on. This is relatively a local movement. It's a grassroots preservation effort, and they will occupy and hold in perpetuity this landscape until 1895, when the federal government steps in and the United States War Department takes control of the Gettysburg Battlefield. And then the big bulk of its history, and what I really look at in my book and my research, is how this landscape has been preserved, interpreted, commemorated by the National Park Service since its acquisition in 1933. So I want to run through quickly the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association era and the War Department, and then we'll get to some of these 20th century interpretation and preservation controversies under the National Park Service administration. So the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association will occupy and preserve and purchase the war's or the landscape's first pieces or parcels of land. They'll erect the battle's first monuments, and they will build the first roads, very rudimentary roads. And what you see here in the photograph, of course, are the fields of Pickett's Charge. You can see the Cadore Barn in the photograph. And by 1895, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association has preserved 522 acres of land. Very commendable efforts in preserving the battle's most decisive and important terrain. They start to interpret Gettysburg as the high tide of the Confederacy. If you're familiar with the first historian here, John Badger Batchelder, Batchelder is the one that centralizes Pickett's Charge to the Gettysburg Narrative. He gives that very funny name to the high water mark, that group of trees. What do we call them? The copse of trees. Where else do you hear an expression of something called the copse of trees? Right? Copse is an old English word to give reverence to. He starts to centralize Pickett's Charge to the Gettysburg Narrative. And by 1880, 1890, the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association is looking for help, mostly economic help. They need more fiscal resources, so the GBMA will appeal to the federal government, asking for the federal government to step in and preserve the 522 acres of the Gettysburg Battlefield. Now think of what's going on in the United States in the 1890s, 1880s. Reconstruction is over. Its problems are unsolved, fraught with peril. The war is unfinished business. Jim Crow is firmly entrenched and ensconced in the American South. The Plessy versus Ferguson case that establishes everything as separate but equal will be ruled in 1896. So the War Department takes control of these battlefields, the first 5, in a very socially and politically divisive era. Gettysburg gains federal recognition on February 11th, 1895. It is the 4th of the War Department fields to gain federal recognition. And what the War Department uses these landscapes for, in part, is a memorial to the men who fought and died here. In its simplest form, Gettysburg and the other Civil War battlefields are a memorial to the men who fought and died here. This is the period of reconciliation. If you read David Blight's book, Race and Reunion, David Blight identifies reconciliation as the predominant mode of Civil War memory, where Union and Confederate veterans can come to places like Gettysburg. They can put aside their sectional differences and they can reconcile. They can agree on a narrative in which all were brave and true. Union and Confederate soldiers both fought heroically. They can ignore those nasty causes of the Civil War, and we can ignore the nasty consequences of the Civil War, and we can talk about things like courage, honor, valor, devotion to duty, and sacrifice. So what forms here, particularly at Gettysburg, as the high tide of this era of reconciliation, is a landscape where Union and Confederate veterans can come back. They can reflect positively on their actions that happened here, July 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 1863, and they can agree that all were brave and true. That's a narrative that we still have lingering, residual narrative, 151 years later. Let's not talk about the causes of the war. Let's not talk about the consequences. Let's find out exactly the position of the 137th New York on July 2nd at noon. Let's talk about that. Well, that narrative is going to get more complicated as we move into the 20th century. Photograph I'm sure you've seen before. This is the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. Woodrow Wilson will come here and deliver one of the keynote addresses in July. He speaks on July the 3rd. Very iconic photograph of Union and Confederate veterans reconciled in a nation united. That theme carries through the 20th century. Gettysburg is a landscape of reconciliation. It is a place to talk about soldiers and generals, tactics and strategies, not causes and consequences, not social issues, not political issues. Let's talk about the battle. Fast forward then 20 years, 1933. The National Park Service gains control of Gettysburg National Military Park and 52 other sites from the United States War Department in 1933. If you think about the history of the National Park Service was established in 1916. And prior to this acquisition in 1933, the National Park Service is mostly a Western system. They mostly control landscapes out west of the Mississippi, places like Yellowstone, Yosemite. They don't have much experience in maintaining and preserving, managing historic sites. So what you see, 1933 onward, is the National Park Service really fumbling to get a good management philosophy and direction of how to take care of a place like Gettysburg. The timing here is important. What's going on in the United States in 1933? Yeah, the Great Depression. One of the things that really struck me when I was researching for the dissertation and the book is the way in which national trends, politics, culture, social trends, impact the management of Gettysburg. And I'll show you some examples of that along the way. The guy in the left of the image, sitting there in the National Park Service uniform, is James McConaughey. He's the first National Park Service superintendent. He is a Harvard graduate, and he's trained as a landscape architect. seems a little problematic, right? I mean, it kind of makes you cringe, a landscape architect maintaining a historic battlefield. So McConaughey's influence is going to be quite important. He'll be superintendent here of this battlefield until 1941. And what he creates here at Gettysburg is a landscape that's pretty, that's preserved and manicured for aesthetic value. If you read through the Gettysburg Times in the 1930s, you'll see little promotional clips in the newspaper where the National Park Service is encouraging visitors to come to Gettysburg in May because the foliage is pretty. Go visit Devil's Den because the springtime foliage is out. Come in October because the fall foliage is out. Never mind talking about the battle. Let's look at this as a pristine landscape. So the 1930s brings some of the most important fundamental changes to the Gettysburg battlefield. The New Deal, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal project, brings an enormous amount of fiscal resources into Gettysburg. So while Americans struggling economically, the Gettysburg battlefield, in fact, does quite well. Here at Gettysburg, there will be 2 different civilian conservation corps camps that will be on this battlefield. One shown in the photograph here, which is McMillan Woods, and another CCC camp will be established at Pitzer's Woods. And these will be in effect until World War II breaks out. So what you'll see in terms of changes in the 1930s are some of the most impressive infrastructure changes in the battlefield's history. What you enjoy today is the 26-mile tour route. The modern tour route is laid down by CCC workers in the 1930s. This is a photograph of CCC workers building the comfort station out by the Pennsylvania Memorial. What strikes you about this photograph? Yeah. Gettysburg's interesting in that the CCC workers here are African American. That's not exceptional. There are other national park sites and state park sites that host CCC camps that have African American workers. That's not exceptional. Shiloh, for example, will be one. But what is interesting and different about Gettysburg is that the CCC camp has black supervisors. And it's picked particularly by the head of the CCC to put black supervisors here in Gettysburg. So you have an all-run, manufactured CCC camp by African American workers and supervisors. Again, until the 1940s. 1942, the CCC camp will close here at Gettysburg. Photograph, the terrain features should be familiar to you. Again, laying the modern infrastructure here. This is, of course, out by General Meade's headquarters that the CCC workers are laying the road. So very much an improvement in infrastructure, creating this modern landscape. Very much a utilitarian usage here in the 1930s by the National Park Service. One of the really interesting, this is like the greatest hits of the Gettysburg battlefield, okay? So one of the really interesting time periods in my research I found here at Gettysburg is World War II. And the ways in which World War II impacted the management of Gettysburg and the ways in which Americans came to the Gettysburg battlefield to find resolve or determination, not to fight Union or Confederate soldiers, of course, but to fight the Germans, the Italians, and the Japanese. So World War II is very much fundamental to the Gettysburg narrative. And look who's emerging at the forefront of the American popular wartime patriotism. What are they quoting? Lincoln in the Gettysburg Address. A good friend of mine, Jared Peatman, just came out with a book called The Long Shadow of the Gettysburg Address, and Jared traces some of these trends in which Americans have interpreted and reinterpreted the Gettysburg Address as well. And Roosevelt, President Franklin Roosevelt, really referenced Lincoln and his wartime powers. And you see quotes from the Gettysburg Address in a lot of the United States propaganda as a means to encourage unity and patriotism to fight on during the Second World War. Here's an example. Encouraging Americans to buy Liberty bonds. Look at the quote that they are referencing from the Gettysburg Address. So in a time in which freedom and democracy has been stifled from millions of people around the world by totalitarian governments, the words of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address ring very true to 1940s Americans. This resurgence of Lincoln in the 1940s. Well, from the Park Service perspective, a lot of interesting things happen here at the Gettysburg Battlefield in the 1940s. The National Park Service will donate several tons of scrap metals to the war's scrap drive. They have put together a plan to essentially dismantle all the monuments on the battlefield and scrap them if the war had gotten that bad. Ironically, the last 3 monuments that were to be preserved, had the war actually escalated that much, were the Virginia Memorial, the North Carolina Memorial, and the Alabama Memorial. So, right? Yeah. And the hierarchy of the scrap material, those are the last 3 to go. And the National Park Service said that was for their artistic merit, right? That's the lost cause for you in the 1940s. So scrap drives, there is a German prisoner of war camp on the battlefield here in the 1940s, of which about 800 German prisoners of war will spend their times on the field of Pickett's Charge. And the National Park Service will acquire, which is a huge interpretive change in the history of the Gettysburg Battlefield and its interpretation. The National Park Service acquires the Gettysburg Cyclorama in April 1942. Now, the Cyclorama had been in town. It was brought here by private interests in 1913 for the 50th anniversary of the battlefield, or for the battle, but the National Park Service purchased it in 1942. You remember where the Cyclorama used to be housed. It's out where the Gettysburg Tour Center is now, up on East Cemetery Hill in that building, and it will be housed there until 1962 when the old Cyclorama Center opens. But what's interesting about this from an interpretive framework is that the acquisition of the Cyclorama perpetuates and reinforces this Pickett's Charge narrative. The narrative that John Batchelder trumped with the early GBMA administration, the acquisition of the Cyclorama reinforces this. And you can read through NPS documents where they just emphasize over and over and over again that everything that they do from an interpretive standpoint has to be centered around the Cyclorama. The placement of the Cyclorama Building in Ziegler's Grove, the creation of a tour route, all of which is designed to reinforce Pickett's Charge as the high water mark of the Confederacy. Again, in which you're telling a story of reconciliation, where all are brave and true. This narrative carries over to the early 21st century, and I'll show you the controversy in changing it. During the 1940s, particularly during World War II, Memorial Day celebrations are very popular here at Gettysburg. They're not new. Memorial Day celebrations or commemorations have been a part of the Gettysburg narrative for some time, but in 1942, 43, 44, and 45, the Memorial Day celebrations are very popular. We'd have 10,000 some visitors coming up here for Memorial Day. The addresses were delivered via radio, so if you couldn't make it, you could tune in to your radio and listen to the Memorial Day speeches. And what happens in Memorial Day is that speakers come to the Gettysburg Battlefield, and they use this landscape as a means to encourage Americans to fight on in World War II. They see this as a place where patriotic ideals can be reinforced, where ideas of citizenship and freedom, of which were fought here in 1863, can be redefined during World War II. There's a good book that came out about a decade ago by Michael Kamen, and in it, it's called Mystic Chords of Memory. It's a quote from Lincoln's second inaugural. And in it, Michael Kamen identifies what he calls a heritage syndrome. And a heritage syndrome is this really interesting phenomenon where we as Americans selectively ignore things that are bad or controversial or divisive, and we encourage and promote parts of our history that are very celebratory. We do this in our own lives. Think about how you remember your childhood. right? You remember all the good things about your childhood. And even things that were bad about your childhood, you remember fondly, right? You always seem to walk to school in the snow, right? And you're always walking uphill both ways, right? That's always the case. And inevitably, you don't have shoes. I mean, it just keeps getting worse, right? But you remember this very fondly. It's like amnesia. We have historical amnesia. And you see that play out in the Civil War to a great extent. So during Memorial Day celebrations, you have the 1940s generation of Americans, that of course is the rostrum in the Soldiers' National Cemetery, coming here to Gettysburg, and they're talking about contemporary events, World War II, and they're linking it back to the sacrifices made here in July 1863. This is the Memorial Day address by the Pennsylvania governor, Edward Martin, and in part, the last couple lines of Edward Martin's Memorial Day address, look what he's quoting, Lincoln. So 1943, think about the state of the world in 1943, American forces moving in through North Africa, the fighting in the Pacific is raging. He's encouraging Americans to think about government of the people, by the people, and not allowing that to perish from the earth. So Gettysburg's relevance to World War II, Lincoln's relevance to World War II, very real, very poignant in American national memory. '60s, Civil War centennial. In the 1950s, baby boom generation, there's a growth of what Edward Linenthal termed the Civil War subculture. This is where the first Civil War roundtables are formed. The first reenactments will be done in the late 1950s. And the Civil War, this is Bruce Catton. I'm sure many of you have read Bruce Catton's volumes. This is where the Civil War becomes very popularized in American culture. So the Civil War centennial is going to be an occasion to commemorate, or celebrate, as it's done in some places, the events 100 years ago. And here again, political, social events are very relevant because the Civil War centennial is occurring simultaneous to what in our country's history? Yeah. Civil rights movement. So think about the social, cultural divisiveness and volatility in the American South. This, of course, is the Freedom Riders here in Anniston, Alabama. Trying to understand what a new birth of freedom means for millions of African Americans in the South and across the nation. The Civil War is unfinished business to them. Reconstruction is a complete failure, promises unbroken. And here's an occasion to establish full equality of what to them the Civil War was always about. So you have this simultaneous occurrence of the civil rights movement to the Civil War centennial, and it breeds really interesting narratives. And of course, not surprising, Gettysburg is the iconic Civil War centennial celebration. Manassas will kick off the events in 1961 July, the reenactment, but the nation's attention focuses to Gettysburg in 1963. NBC and CBS had done promotional pieces. National news magazines focus on Gettysburg and lead up to all this attention here in July of '63. President John Kennedy will visit the battlefield in March. This is Kennedy standing, of course, at Little Round Top. He'll take a tour of the battlefield in March. And July, well, 2 weeks, late June, first week of July, 1863, Gettysburg celebrates its 100th anniversary. The photograph here is interesting for a couple of perspectives. This shows us the National Park Service Cyclorama Building. You can see it to the far right of the image. This was opened in March of 1962. It's part of a Mission 66 initiative that the National Park Service undertakes. Then it was dedicated formally on November 19th, again linking back to the importance of Abraham Lincoln. But over 400,000 visitors come to Gettysburg in July of 1963. 400,000 visitors in 1 month. I mean, look, you all thought you had parking problems, right? That's what I say. I mean, this narrative is always the same. We're never doing anything new. It's always the same. For the first time in its history, the National Park Service will record over 2 million visitors in 1963. Over 2 million visitors will come here in 1963. So you have 2 weeks worth of pageantry and fanfare. You have series of parades in town. You have a quote-unquote reenactment that's done on the 3rd of July, shown here with Confederate and Union soldiers meeting at the Stonewall. They come across, and when the Confederate soldiers get to the Stonewall, the band plays Dixie. The U.S. Army band, ironically, plays Dixie. And then they transition over, of course, and play the Star-Spangled Banner. The 2 weeks worth of celebrations and pageantry, monument dedications and rededications. And this is where you see the narrative of the civil rights movement very relative to how Americans in July 1963 are remembering the Civil War. That, of course, is the photograph of the sit-in movement, the first sit-in in Greensboro, North Carolina at a Woolworths. And the quote to the side of the image is New Jersey Governor Richard Hughes comes here on July the 1st, and he will rededicate a monument, a New Jersey monument, down on Cemetery Ridge. And in his dedication speech of the monument, he talks about racial equality. The Civil War is not fought to preserve the Union lily white or the Jim Crow. It is fought for liberty and justice for all. And you can go across the battlefield and find scores of Northern and Southerners dedicating or rededicating monuments, and their monument dedication speeches very much include this notion of civil rights and asking themselves 100 years later what the Civil War was all about. What was the 51,000 casualties here at this battle? What did it mean? And what's its impact? On the other side of the battlefield, over at Seminary Ridge, if you drive down West Confederate Avenue, the Confederate state markers, quite a few of them are dedicated, erected during the Civil War centennial. Texas, Florida, Georgia. This is the marker to Florida. And a Florida congressman comes up in July 1963, and his dedication speech very much places contemporary Americans back in the mindset of Cold War equality. And he's saying if the United States of America is going to prevail and defeat communism, we have to be united internally. We cannot have domestic strife because it only weakens us in the eyes of communist leaders abroad. So you see a lot in 1963 of this linking, this simultaneous occurrence between the civil rights movement and the Civil War centennial. Who else is here in July 1963? What Southern governor will come to the Gettysburg Battlefield? Very good. Yes, George Wallace. George Wallace comes to the Gettysburg Battlefield in July, right? July of 63. Now, the Alabama Monument had been erected and dedicated decades earlier. So Wallace is here. He speaks at various places on the battlefield. He'll be at the first ever campfire program that's held out at Pitzer's Woods at the amphitheater. And when he's speaking at the South Carolina Monument dedication, George Wallace gives very much a typical saber-rattling states' rights defense to the Constitution. Now, this is July 1963. What was he doing in May 1963? Yeah, there's two big land grant institutions in Alabama. I'm a graduate of the better one, okay? He's standing in the schoolhouse door at that school in Tuscaloosa in physical defiance of integration. And now, 2 months later, he's up on this battlefield speaking about Constitution and states' rights. So for him, the Civil War and the memory of the Civil War and the rhetoric that he's promoting is very much different than the colleagues on the other side of the battlefield. Very different. Now, the National Park Service and Americans more broadly had an opportunity in the 1960s to look at the Civil War narrative and to include questions of race, slavery, causes, consequences. But the Civil War centennial passes without any change to the dominant Civil War narrative. And it would not be until the late 20th century when the rise of what we call in academia social history changes the Civil War narrative. And this is one of the most interesting, controversial periods in the history of the Gettysburg Battlefield. Some of this should be familiar to you all, late 90s, early 2000s history. Think about what's going on in our country in the mid-90s, late 90s. It's what we call the culture wars. You remember how politicized everything became in the 1990s and the residual implications of that today? You remember Lynn Cheney standing very defiantly complaining about the national standards for history? Do you remember in 1995, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum had this terrific exhibit built to commemorate and educate on the Enola Gay, which is the plane that dropped the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima in Japan. The Smithsonian had to cancel the exhibit on the Enola Gay because they couldn't please everybody. Air Force veterans and Japanese American civilians in the 1990s are not going to agree on the same narrative. And it ended up being this huge political fiasco. Congress got involved, the head of the Smithsonian Air and Space Institute resigns, and he throws his hands up, and this exhibit is canceled. So Americans become very interested in history in the 1990s, and they become very much politicized in our interpretations of history. And that plays out in a very monumental way on the Gettysburg Battlefield and the war's other battlefields as well, but Gettysburg takes central stage to this. So the 1990s, early 20th century brings two big issues to the fore here in Pennsylvania. One is going to be a challenge to this reconciliation narrative, and the other is going to be physical changes to the Gettysburg Battlefield landscape. Now, remember, this narrative of reconciliation had been embedded in our Gettysburg narrative since the Veterans era. This is 1913, the 50th anniversary of the battle. Virginia Governor William Hodges Mann speaking and saying, "We're not here to talk about the causes and consequences, let's talk about the battle." So in the 1990s, when you get people starting to encourage a broader interpretation of the American Civil War, this is in direct defiance to a narrative that had been so much wedded to the Gettysburg story since the 1880s. And love him or not, at the forefront, leading this for the National Park Service is Superintendent John Lacher. And Lacher gave a speech in 1995 that created a firestorm of controversy, where he says that the National Park Service has deliberately shied away from talking about any notions of fixing blame for the war. Well, this address is going to be published in some of the Civil War popular magazines. I think it gets picked up by Civil War News. And within just a matter of weeks, there are calls for John Lacher's resignation. It's one of the most interesting periods to research, going through what Americans are writing into the Gettysburg Battlefield and how they interpret the war and what they think should be taught and told on this battlefield. This is 1995. 5 years later, the United States Congress passes a mandate. They work it into the 2000 congressional directive that will encourage Congress encourages the National Park Service to include a discussion of slavery in their interpretation. the unique role that slavery played in causing the Civil War in individual battle sites. Monumental outcry. Jerry Russell, who's a leader of Heritage PAC, he's since deceased, he will take he'll come to the fore in discussing this. He says battlefields are about honor. And if we have to include a discussion of slavery here, it will be a cosmic threat to talk about the war's causes and consequences. Well, for a lot of Americans, this is a very real issue. The USA Today did a report, which they did through Ancestry.com, and it came out that 2/3 of Americans today have an ancestor who fought or was living during the American Civil War. So this is a very personal issue to us. And you can see this kind of rhetoric play out in Americans' reactions to the changes that happened here in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This should make you all pleased, right? Landscape rehabilitation changes are... What? There we go. There was controversy when the tower went up, and there's controversy when the tower comes down. I don't know. This is my point exactly, right? I mean, we're never going to have a unified narrative here. This is 2000, July the 3rd, 2000, the demolition of that tower. And if you've been here to the battlefield, if you're repeat visitors, you can see some of these changes play out before you. I said I worked here for 9 summers as a seasonal when I was in graduate school, and I would come back in after being away at school, and I would come back and drive through the battlefield, and these huge swaths of trees were gone. I mean, the landscape changes here are amazing that's occurred over the last 10 to 15 years, but they're not new. The National Park Service had a history of landscape rehabilitation. They did some of the first non-historic woodlot removals in 1940. You wouldn't hear about it because it didn't play out in the national media, and it was nowhere near as controversial or sensationalized as it was or is today. But look this. This is 1940. This is McMillan Woods. This is before, after. This is the removal, early Park Service removal of some of the non-historic woodlots, non-historic structures here today. This is on West Confederate Avenue. So the landscape rehabilitation changes, just to leave you with the last couple points, are enormously controversial. The National Park Service undertook a program, right, to remove over 500 acres of non-historic woodlots. I had many laughs in researching this section for my dissertation in my book. And you can see this is a very polarizing issue. Rape of the battlefield is a common usage. But what this does is it puts the National Park Service as an active agent in shaping your interpretations of the battlefield. This is Smith's Battery up in Devil's Den before the woodlot. This is after. This is 2010 landscape restoration in the Valley of Death. That 1930 era's Comfort Station has subsequently been removed. Right. I know. I think the Georgia and the Alabama troops said the same thing. Replanting historic orchards, fencing patterns. This is a battlefield where you can feel very confident that what you're seeing out in the landscape accurately reflects an 1863 Vista. This opened in 1921, and for a long time it was the National Park Service's Visitor Center, which was demolished in 2009. And now you can even see the parking lots have been demolished and torn up, the asphalt parking lots. Very controversial in removing the Cyclorama Building, which had dominated Ziegler's Grove since 1962. This building has come down in March of 2013. And for those of you that were here July last year, you had the opportunity to take part in the 150 anniversary activities here in July, which the National Park Service did a fantastic job in the sesquicentennial celebration of this battle. They offered 287 ranger programs, the National Park Service did, to over 110,000 visitors on Ranger programs. An amazing feat, and it definitely underscored the high water mark of the Civil War in many Americans' mind is the Gettysburg Battlefield. So what the last 150 or 151 years shows us is that the Gettysburg Battlefield is a landscape unlike any other. The 6,000 acres that are occupied and managed by the National Park Service are the most contested, sensationalized, and controversial acres of American soil. So Gettysburg is more than a memorial to war. It's more than a place to talk about tactics and strategies and generals. It's a powerful public place. Some even call it a holy shrine. But to all of us, Gettysburg is a place that shall not perish from the earth. Thank you all very much. My students are as excited when my lectures are over, too.
Jen, could you say a few words about the Camp Colt?
Okay, Camp Colt, during World War I, and that's one of the eras that I did not include in this talk, during World War I, the War Department houses Camp Colt here. It's primarily used as a tank training, and it's mostly out on the fields of Pickett's Charge. And there's some historic photographs that linger around that show these huge tanks climbing over and maneuvering over the fields of Pickett's Charge up into the Stonewall area. And young Dwight David Eisenhower is stationed here during World War I. This is when he first becomes very interested in the Gettysburg history and the Gettysburg Battlefield. And then that's going to close, I think, in 1919. Camp Colt will close. The officers have it pretty good here. They'll build a swimming pool right in front of the angle, Pickett's Charge. I know. Just imagine if that was there on July 3rd, right? I think Alonzo Cushing would have been doing something different. Yeah, but it's very much this duality of the Gettysburg landscape about preservation versus utilitarian values. And for a lot of its history, the War Department and the National Park Service weighed on the utilitarian value. The War Department particularly so. What else?
Can you comment on some of the more modern or newer Confederate monuments in 1965, Arkansas monument in 1970s, early 1970s, Mississippi monument, some of the words on those monuments? Is that at all controversial?
It is. If you look at those monuments, they're very much the lost cause culture. Going up, the Mississippi monument, Louisiana monument goes up at the same time. Florida, Texas, Georgia, very much of a lost cause kind of culture. And the dedication speeches, if you go in the Park Library, John, and do some research, the dedication speeches are in there, and it's very much imbued with this lost cause kind of rhetoric. And the sculptures very much reflect this. I mean, look at the Louisiana and the Mississippi monuments, right? Confederate soldiers are depicted like David and Goliath. I mean, these are huge Herculean depictions in the monuments, but that's reflective of a different memory of the Civil War than the ones going up in the 1880s by Union veterans. Please.
What do you think as we
Okay.
look ahead to the next 10 to 15 years will be what kind of change and controversy do you think will be here?
Change in controversy in the next 10 to 15 years. As a historian, I'm much more comfortable in the past than I am the future. But what I can say with a firm degree of certainty is that Gettysburg will always be controversial. Anything will be controversial. Just on July the 1st, Civil War Preservation Trust purchased Lee's headquarters and will continue this landscape rehabilitation program, but you'll continue to see landscape rehabilitation grow in a very important way, and it's always going to be this site that's contested.
Why has the federal government largely ignored the 150th commemoration of the Civil War? At the highest level, why have they ignored it? There's no national commission.
Right.
Or is it done very little?
Right. You're right. I don't have a good answer for that question. The National Park Service, and I know that's unsatisfactory, the National Park Service is doing its own thing, but there's not a very much a proactive, overarching effort by the federal government at all. A bad answer? Those are the kinds my students give. We're done. Have a happy 4th of July. I'll be hanging around.
We want to thank Jen so much, Dr. Murray, for her talk.